Many of you have asked how we produce assets in our 2.5D art style, so I put together this video to go over the process that I went through while creating this car step by step. The first step is a terrible drawing. The goal here is just to rough out the general idea and proportions of what I want to make, then later do a second pass to clean it up. Here I'm just blocking in all the major details I know I want, like tail lights, bumpers, seats, so on. After we've roughed everything in, now we trace. The goal of this step is to add details and clean up the line work a bit. This isn't going to be the actual line work on the asset, but it's necessary to finalize the design before testing it in 3D. Here I'm taking the rough shapes where things are supposed to be, like the headlamps or the front grille, and figuring out what they actually look like. Once the design has been finalized, I fill it in with white, and now it's time to disassemble it into parts that we can work with in 3D. Simply take the lasso tool and hack the image to bits. It's important to separate any detail that occludes something behind it that may become visible from another angle. The general rule of thumb that I use is if I can imagine fitting my hand between the two pieces, they should probably be separate. Otherwise, I can simplify and keep them together with no issue. Of course, after we finished hacking, now we have to redraw all those parts that were once occluded. Here I'm redrawing the roof of the car where the bike rack was, and also the tires that were being occluded by the wheel well. You also see me using a program called Lazy Nizumi sometimes to help me draw straight isometric lines whenever I need them. I toggle it on and off depending on when I want something to feel more organic. It does a whole bunch more than what I'm using it for, and I'd highly recommend it for any digital illustrator. After we finish separating all the parts and redrawing all the missing details, I lay them out into a sort of sprite sheet that we can import into 3ds Max and begin 3D-ifying the drawing. Once in Max, I import our texture atlas and I put it on a plane directly in front of the camera. I've set up this camera to exactly match the isometric perspective of the drawing, which is a 2-to-1 slope or a 30-degree downward tilt from the camera. Now we can start to build basic geometry that matches up with those parts. I usually start with simple cubes and slowly add detail to match the forms a little more. The great thing about this style is you don't really need complex geometry. You only need to capture the major forms, and then the line work will carry the rest. I typically keep 2 views open as I work, one from the perspective of the drawing to match up the details, and then one free camera that I can use to more easily manipulate things. I like to jump into the 3D at this point just to test to make sure all the parts are working the way that I hope they would. If they don't, I can go back to the 2D and iterate until I have something that works. This way I don't waste a bunch of time rendering assets that just won't work in the end. After I finish roughing in the forms, I go back over all the places where there would be hard edges, and I add a couple of edge loops on either side. This way we can have shading on our assets that don't give the telltale signs of being built with harsh polygons, and make it feel more genuinely 2D without needing to bake normal maps or anything like that. Sometimes I get people who ask, why go through all this trouble? Why not just do it in 3D? I thought a lot about this, and I've come to the conclusion you totally could get a similar look, but it loses something. The gestural lines of the illustration are often lost amidst the mechanical process of pushing polygons, and it generally needs a lot more work and attention to retain. Here, you can just be in the flow as an illustrator and know that every line that you lay down is gonna be in the final result. It's very empowering. I also use a weighted normal modifier, which tends to give much better surface shading for low polygon assets like this than the standard behavior. It works by biasing the vertex normals towards faces that are larger, essentially. Now that I have the geometry done, we can project the texture atlas onto the geometry by adding a UV modifier and acquiring the alignment from the image plane that we've been using to construct our parts. All that's left to do in Max is assemble it back together again and hope that everything works. Here I'm adding the seats, the roof of the car rack. This is also a good time to test what the model might look like in your game engine of choice. Max is particularly terrible with handling transparency, so I like to double check it in Unity before I move on. But assuming everything is looking good, we can jump back to 2D and render the textures. The first thing that I do for my particular style is an ink pass with a slightly textured brush with a constant line thickness. Here I'm paying extra attention to clean line work, as this will be the last time that I'll be redrawing them. I also use broken lines for convex edges to make the detail just a little bit less dense across the asset. I lay down some flat colors to figure out the color scheme before moving on to shading. Then I shade with a simple one-tone multiply layer that assumes that the light source is coming from directly above. I try not to go too heavy with the shading because really the game engine is going to do most of the heavy lifting here, but it is important to shade anything that doesn't actually have geometry to reinforce the shape. Things like seams or surface details like vents and such should get just a little bit of love. For extra polish, I also shade the line work to be darker on the downward facing edges and also lighter on all the convex ones. I find this really helps the artwork to pop off the screen. I'm really inspired by an artist that goes by Kokefi, I think, on Twitter, who shares a lot of these same ideas in his work. Here I'm adding back all of those edge highlights that really makes this style work so well. Finally, we can bring it all back into Unity. By default, the materials will look bad. So I've set up my own materials with a little bit of shader graph work. I apply one for the car body and then also a glass material for the windows. And lastly, we can make it come alive with animation. Here I'm just using Unity's animation editor because I didn't need a crazy rig or bones or anything like that. I'm just animating the hierarchy directly. And here's the final result. I hope you found this video useful. Feel free to hit subscribe for more content like this or join our Discord in the link below.